everybody, today I am going to be talking to you about the importance of a mock-up. Now I will explain how to actually fit a mock-up in a future video, but for this one I'm just going to talk about what is a mock-up in general, why do you use it, how to make one, etc. So basically, what is a mock-up? Well, if you think about the word mock, it's basically an imitation corset, but it's not a full corset. So this is used to test the fit and the comfort of a final corset. Other people might call this a muslin if it's made from muslin cloth, or they might call it a toile. And so they will go through one or several toile fittings or mock-up fittings. So basically you can make sure that the corset is going to give you the right type of silhouette, that it's going to be comfortable. If it's an overbust, that, you know, all your bits are covered properly. And you can just make sure that everything is the way you want it to before you cut into your good fabric and you make the full corset. So you don't have to put a huge amount of effort into a mock-up, but basically the more faithful that the mock-up is to the final corset, then the closer the results the mock-up will be to the final corset. So if you're new to making corsets, then you can actually use mock-ups as practice runs as well for constructing the final corset. So sometimes you might only need one mock-up, sometimes you might be 2 or 3 mock-ups by the time you feel that a pattern is good enough for the final product. But if you practice your corset assembling skills on these mock-ups, then by the time you actually make your final corset, it will feel a lot easier and a lot less daunting for you. Now I'm showing you a close-up of the fabric here that I used for the mock-up, and I'm not sure if it's coming out on camera, but I actually did use herringbone couture for this particular mock-up. And I know that some people are going, because couture is typically pretty expensive, but if you live in Canada, where twill is between $10 to $14 a meter, then it actually costs about the same to buy domestic couture, and you can make your mock-ups of that instead of regular twill. Domestic couture, it tends to be a little bit more stretchy. It tends to have a looser weave than say English couture, but it is easier to follow along the grain, and it behaves more similarly to English couture, which I use for my final corsets more often than not. So I like to make my mock-ups out of domestic or American couture for this reason. This mock-up here has 10 bones. It's single boned on the seams here. Your mock-up doesn't have to have as many bones as the final corset is going to, because when everything's said and done, this final project is going to have double boned on the seams. But it should have some bones in here to give it the right structure and to make sure that it's not going to wrinkle on your body when you try it on, because you don't want your mock-up to wrinkle on you. It's going to give you a different shape compared to your final product if you do that. So like I said before, my mock-up is single boned, and this has real steel bones in it. Some people actually use plastic boning in their mock-ups to save time and to save money if they hadn't purchased their steel bones yet. And as long as the length is okay, I can actually just use the steel bones in this corset and put it in the final corset. You know, obviously I'm going to have to cut more of them if it's going to be a double boned corset, but I don't find it to be very wasteful to use steel boning in my corset, because like I said, it's going to be more faithful, it's going to be more representative to how the final corset is going to look and feel by using steel instead of plastic. And also I can just reuse them anyways. If any of these bones are too long, then they can be cut down, and if they need to be longer, then in that situation I can cut new bones, but I can use these bones for a different project later on because I'm constantly making new things. So like I said, all the hardware in this corset can be easily removed and transferred to another mock-up, including the entire back lacing system here. And unfortunately I can't remember whose idea this was. I think it may have been Julia Bremble from So Curvy Corset Kits who taught this tip. Basically the back lacing panels are designed to be sewn onto a mock-up, and then the entire lacing system here can be removed. You just use a seam ripper, you rip out these lines of stitching that are on the last panel of this mock-up, and it can be transferred to another mock-up later on. So this saves you from having to waste grommets, and the busk as well is inserted in one layer, just wrapped around. Just cut holes where you need to put in the loops or the knobs here, and the busk can be easily moved on to another mock-up as well. So here is one mock-up, and here is another mock-up right here. These two mock-ups are made from 2 different patterns. They have the same final measurements in the basically the length, the underbust, the waist, and the hip circumference. They're for the same person. But they are made from two different types of patterns. So the person who these mock-ups are for, she is going to be transferring the busk, the bones, the lacing panel from one mock-up to the other. So she'll try on this one first. She can analyze the fit. Once she makes any necessary adjustments, then she can transfer the hardware to this corset and then analyze the fit of this one. And I have deliberately used two different construction processes for each mock-up. So for this one, the way that this particular mock-up was done, you can see that the construction process could be considered very similar to what you might actually see in a final corset. So the seams are double stitched here, the boning channels are made in the seam allowances. So if this mock-up fits well and you couldn't care less what it looks like, you could actually probably just put binding on this corset and call it a really ugly foundation wear corset. And on the other hand, here is a mock-up that is a little bit more mock-up-y. It's it's really more rugged than the one that I had shown you before. So the seams are single stitched, and if I actually turn it around to the other side, you can see that there are big seam allowances here. So if there's any necessary changes that need to be made to the pattern of the corset, if anything needs to be let out to give more space, say in the rib cage area, then this seam can be easily let out and you will still have a little bit more space to pin in this situation. You can see here that I put the boning channels in the center of the panels, so they're not on the seam right there. So this mock-up is still going to basically have the same number of bones as the mock-up that I had showed you before, the prettier looking mock-up, but these ones are in the center of the panel, so it's not going to interfere with any adjustments that need to be made if you need to take in or let out any of the seams here. And these bone casings here I can even recycle later on. Some people, they don't use bone casings at all, they just use strips of fabric. Some people even, they just tape the bones down using duct tape or masking tape. I don't do that for this piece because, one, this piece needs to travel, and also I don't like how duct tape leaves a sticky residue on the steel bones later on. I find that it makes the bones unusable after it gets that kind of gross residue on it. So I prefer to just recycle these bone casings. And here you can see that I also put a waist tape in my mock-up. A lot of people don't use a waist tape in their mock-up. I like to most of the time. Otherwise, the mock-up might stretch at the waist, and then you might think, oh, I patterned this corset to be too big for me. And then you might adjust the pattern to be smaller, and then once the final corset is made with the waist tape and everything, it might actually be end up being on the small side for you. So here I've just really quickly sewn on the waist tape. This particular twill tape was pretty cheap, so I don't consider it a loss to use it in a mock-up. And one last thing that I will mention to you, you can see the seams more clearly here because I used black thread. On this side I actually used white thread, so I'll just focus on this side. You can see that I stay stitched the top and the bottom edges of this corset. Sometimes I serge it instead of stay stitching it, and a lot of the time I will also stay stitch the waistline of the mock-up before I actually assemble these pieces together. So I can see the markings from both sides when I'm pinning the panels together, and it really helps me to visualize the length of the panels. So you can see here there was actually an error in my measuring of this particular panel 3, because from the waist to the top edge is actually a little bit longer than I had drafted it for panel 2 and panel 4. So I need to bring that down about half a centimeter right there. So maybe I'll show you in a future video how to true your corset patterns as well, because that might help you a little bit later on. I have seen people who just, they have uneven panels, but then they just shave it down later on and it's not a huge deal. But if you are super picky, then I can show you how to true your mock-ups for something like that. Another thing that the stay stitching does is it helps to prevent warping or stretching of the material when you're assembling the corset and when you're trying it on. Because when you are wearing a final corset, then it has the binding on the top and the bottom, so it doesn't actually stretch that much because it has that stitching there to hold it. And when you have a mock-up that's just fabric and nothing else up there, it might have a tendency to feel a little bit loose. So I usually stay stitch the top and the bottom edges, or I serge them just to give them a tiny bit more stability and to hopefully prevent them from warping or stretching while I'm assembling the corset or while I'm fitting it. It might give just the tiniest little bit more structure in there. That's the hope anyways. When I am making my final corset, I do also have a tendency to stay stitch the top and the bottom of the panels, although less so at the waistline here. You can see that the stay stitching of the waistline at the mock-up, it also helps with practice and lining up the waistline of these corset panels, because that is absolutely the most important part, lining up each panel right at the waistline so that you have the right amount of pressure going around the body. Now, when I am making my final corset, I do not usually stay stitch the waistline of the corset panels because the fabric that I'm working with, it can often be a non-self-healing fabric, so it shows the pin pricks. So I will usually use this for mock-ups and for practice, but I will leave out the stay stitching at the waistline for my final corsets. So I hope this has helped, showing you two different ways to make corset mock-ups and to show you basically what the purpose of a mock-up is and how it can help. And so if you have any experience making mock-ups and you would like to share your tips and tricks, please leave a comment down below. And if you have any questions about making mock-ups in general, then feel free to leave a question below. I'd be happy to answer your questions. I will go into a video about actually fitting a mock-up later on, but of course everything has to start with a bit of an introduction, so I need to help you understand what a mock-up is and what it's for before actually going into the fitting of it. So I hope this has helped. Thank you guys so much. I'll see you in a few days for the next video. Bye.